So yeah, we've talked a lot about these things that we can do individually, collectively, personal action, climate activism, becoming politically active. And the last class, we talked about communication. In terms of personal action, we've talked about things like largely plant-based diet, food waste, automobile ownership, air travel, minimalism, reconsidering things like fashion, and so on. But what if you wanted to jump ahead to the end game? If you wanted to imagine what the future would be like, in other words, if you wanted to work out right now how to live a largely, completely sustainable life, would it be possible here in California, in the US? People are still talking. Yeah. So it's a good question because this is what the future will have to hold. Living this lifestyle won't necessarily get you to the future. We still need collective activism and political action, communication, and all that. But is a life like that possible? And I wanted to gear that question to you folks. It would be different in other parts of the world, even different in other parts of the United States. But living the kind of life that you might want to live here in California, hopefully you'd become successful and have a career and all that. But then how would you live this sort of life? So let me jump to the first iClicker poll. You can find it. Okay, so have you ever considered making significant lifestyle changes to be more sustainable? Not have you done it, but have you considered it, or are you considering it now? Maybe you definitely have, you've kind of toyed with the idea a little, maybe even milder than that. It's a passing thought, you sort of thought of it, or definitely no, where you're not really sure, you haven't considered it. So let's see what the answer is. Most people, again, the first two answers are the biggest, and everyone in the room, one way or another, either in a passing way or in a very definite way, have considered making those lifestyle changes. Okay, great. So let me just make that smaller. Let's jump to our next slide and into the lecture proper. So what this is, to be very clear, what we're talking about to be sustainable is to reduce greenhouse gases of the average American by a factor of 10, to literally be 1/10 of what they are. Why is that important? Because depending on how you calculate it, the total greenhouse emissions for the average American is like 16 to 20 metric tons per year. The Paris Agreement, COP21, they stated that, and scientists have repeated this again and again, we really, as planetary citizens, need to emit no more than 2 metric tons a year. So if the average American is 20 metric tons or so, you need to bring that down to 2 metric tons. And would it be possible, not just for an individual, so a lot of those minimalists we met were like individuals, but we're talking here just, a typical family in California, a couple parents, couple children, could they live that lifestyle? And if so, if you could actually do this, if you could achieve it, what would it be like? Could it possibly be a good life, fulfilling life that made everyone happy? In other words, and I'll talk about it in a minute, we often think of, yeah, you could do this, but you would mean doing without all these things, all those things that Donald Trump responded to the Green New Deal with. You'd have to do without, beef and cars and air travel and all. Could that really be a good life? That's the question. So there's another documentary I didn't have you watch. I could actually put it up on GauchoCast. If anyone wants it, let me know. Called No Impact Man. It's 2009. It's a little old at this point. But the lead character, No Impact Man, and his partner and their small daughter, she's like a toddler, huddled in their dark, cold Manhattan apartment with seemingly no electricity. The electricity's been turned off because they want to be sustainable, and they only have candles for light, and there they are at night, huddled there. Is that what this would mean? Is that the kind of future that we would have to be sustainable? I think a lot of people think that, and one of the reasons it's not a very good film to watch because it leaves you with that opinion, only because the lead character, the No Impact Man, didn't really think through what this would be like. Fortunately, we have a better example with someone who really did think through what this would be like. And that's the documentary that we have for this week, which is Being the Change. And the subtitle is Live Well and Spark a Climate Revolution. And it chronicles the life of Peter Kalmus and his family. Peter has 2 children and a partner. And at the time, they were living in Pasadena, California. So I selected this because if you're from California, and you imagine what kind of life could it be like to be here, not somewhere else in the world, but here, what would it be like? I should mention Peter Kalmus is a friend of mine. We had him come to English 24 last year. He'll probably come this spring as well. He's a climate scientist at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. And as a climate scientist, he's particularly well suited to assess his own climate footprint. Who better to calculate your own personal footprint, not by using an online calculator, which we're going to do at the end of this term, but someone who really knows all the numbers and looks at them very carefully. And it turns out that his footprint is exceptionally small. And just to continue with, he has a book by the same name, Being the Change. We're going to read from it for next week. And he notes that his greenhouse gas emissions are just that. They're at the end game. He's consuming about 1/10 of the resources and producing 1/10 of the emissions of the average American. About 2 metric tons annually. And again, that's the goal set by the Paris Agreement, COP21. So let me continue. So Kalmus notes in the book, and I'm going to quote him here because he really succinctly gets to it. This level of reduction, while incomplete, allows my family and me to continue living a normal suburban life, and again, in Pasadena, California. This suggests that similar reduction is well within reach for many of us. So what he was trying to do here is set an example that it can be done. It's not like you're, cold without electricity and only candles, but if you watch the documentary, if you haven't already, you'll actually see what this kind of life is like right here in California. And for most people, and as more people make significant reductions and systemic alternatives to fossil fuels become increasingly available, going the rest of the way is going to become easier. Kalmus adds that, and he's clear about this, I still emit nearly twice the average person in Bangladesh and infinitely more than a wild non-human earthling, meaning an animal, like a deer or a fox or something. But I mean, it is interesting to note that while this might seem really intense for an American, reducing your emissions to 1/10 of where they were, this is still twice as many as someone living in Bangladesh. And remember, we took a trip to Bangladesh in some way during, while watching The True Cost, where we saw those factories there. So yeah, it's great for an American, but it's still not what most people are doing. And it's interesting to note that this comes from a scientist, right, and a climate scientist, because really what Peter's done here is a cultural change, a change in the way that he lives. But given his background, you might assume that he would advocate for technological solutions, right? Scientist, he knows technology. The things we keep hearing about, electric cars, self-driving electric cars, new generation of solar cells, they're more efficient. In fact, we're working on them here at UCSB with nanotechnology. But instead, he doesn't go the high-tech route. He wants to go in a way that anyone can duplicate and that you don't need a fortune to do it. So yes, having a self-driving electric car, tens of thousands of dollars, fueling that with solar panels on your roof, more expensive. Peter eschews all that and says, well, let's get a bicycle, and a bicycle solves that problem. And Humanure, we're going to talk about that. Humanure, and if you see it a little bit in the documentary, but you do see it in the documentary, but also in the book, is actually composting your own waste. So we'll talk about that. The title Being the Change, just a little trivia, but you may have seemed vaguely familiar when you heard it. It's a reference to this quote by Gandhi, and it's attributed to him, and it's not quite clear that he said it, but it's kind of always will be connected with him now. and that is be the change that you want to see in the world. So in other words, instead of just reading about something and giving it lip service and talking about it and saying all these great things, the best way, and we kind of talked about it last time with communication, according to Gandhi, is do more, talk less. Live a life that is consistent with your values. And when you do that, you will bring about a change in the world. That sounds, you got to remember, this is from one of the pioneers in the 20th century of passive resistance, but this is a way of changing the world without like jumping right in and sort of attacking it, living a life that people will see, wonder about, and then maybe make a change too. So Peter Kalmus, on picking a title, I think it's a great title, that we should all, if we want change, we should talk less and instead be the change. And how would you be being the change? What might being the change be like? Well, read the book, watch the documentary, and you're going to be watch the whole documentary and read part of the book in this class. The publisher describes on the back of the book, and in fact, Peter wrote this, and it's very succinct and right. We all want to be happy, and in some sense, that's the end game for humanity. We might not think that, but the Dalai Lama actually came out and very succinctly noted this. What's the goal of life? According to the Dalai Lama, be happy. We don't always think that, but it is to be happy. Now, that doesn't mean that you just have to be completely self-involved in doing self-care, because how can you be happy in a world where there is enormous suffering of other individuals, people that you may even know, let alone across the planet, and of beings everywhere, not just human beings? We all want to be happy, yet as we consume ever more in a frantic bid for happiness, global warming worsens. And we've seen that, right? I mean, with things like the opposite of minimalism that the minimalists address, or in the true cost, where we're just wanting more and more and more, and will always be associated as an icon of that, is fast fashion. Fast fashion is this desire for more and more and more. But alarmed by drastic changes now occurring in the Earth's ecosystem, the author, Peter Kalmus, a climate scientist and a suburban father of two, embarked on a journey to change his life and the world in the process. He began by bicycling, growing his own food, meditating, making other simple, fulfilling changes. Ultimately, he slashed his climate impact to 1/10 of the US average and became happier in the process. So that last sentence, I don't know what's more important there. So in other words, Peter Kalmus and his family embarked on this project. Clearly, it was meant to slash his climate impact by 1/10. Yes, but also, and this is the wonderful intersectional thing here, also be happy. That was the goal too. And I would argue that even if you didn't care about the climate aspect of this, if you just wanted to be happy, then you would also be slashing your climate footprint in the process. And a good example of that would be those minimalists. They don't really seem to care much about the climate. They seem to be really self-involved about making themselves happier. And I'm echoing the criticism many people made in your comments, and I think it's a good one. But they're not doing it for the planet. They're doing it for themselves, but they've discovered that all these things that are supposed to make us happy, this sort of rampant consumer machine, is not doing the job. In fact, it's doing just the opposite. And Peter Kalmus wants to yoke them together in a way that the minimalists didn't. And he's saying, do this for yourself. Yes, do it for the planet. This is a win-win because both will benefit. So continuing from the back of the book. By the way, the book, as I'll note next time, is available online for free. Peter's, over a couple of years, made more and more chapters available. So you'll be reading from a PDF, but you can read the whole thing. Being the Change explores the connections between our individual daily actions and our collective predicament. It merges science, spirituality, and practical action to develop a satisfying and appropriate response to global warming. The core message is deeply optimistic. Living without fuels is not only possible, it can be better. Wait, living without fossil fuels is not only possible, it can be better. Yeah, that's the argument here. And that is the core message. And that's why it is optimistic, because again, it's a win-win. It's better for you, it's better for the planet. And that's a startling message. And it's one that I think that the minimalists were trying to deliver, but they weren't able to pull it all together the way Peter Kalmus was able to do that. Uh, yeah, and the thing is, we are often told that the climate crisis will mean that we need to do without. That's why, like the attack Donald Trump made on AOC's Green New Deal, focused on that we're going to have to do without these things. And Trump laid out that list, if you remember. So here are cars, planes, spacious houses, beef, all sorts of meat, scores of appealing consumer goods, scores of fashion, and so forth. It sounds like a life of deprivation. In other words, we're being deprived of all these things. If we act on the climate crisis in an appropriate way, we're going to have things taken away from us, especially when we think about people who have all this. And by that, I mean, people in my generation where really we sort of pioneered excessive consumption in the 20th, coming roaring out of the Second World War, consuming more and more. But to not just lay the blame there. I mean, look at any influencer today. The people that were encouraged to want to be, the people that were as soon as you go online, you encounter these people again and again and again. And they almost, if there's one thing that universally connects them, is they consume and consume lots and are encouraging us to and consume. And they have mountains and mountains of stuff. So if that's the goal, to be, par excellence, a consumer, the person that consumes the most, has the most, is the most successful by virtue of the fact that they are supersized consumers, then yeah, taking that away is going to be a sad thing to the consumerist mindset. So it may seem then that there's a problem if the road to happiness is paved with stuff, with having lots of things and possessions. Then it is paved with carbon. It is paved with carbon emissions. More accurately, you need to be responsible if you are, first-rate influencer, the release of literally tons of carbon per month if you want it all, if you want happiness. And even if you're not a supersized influencer, remember 20 tons of CO2 is emitted by the average American. Emitting a little more, 24 tons, it means that you're releasing 2 metric tons of CO2 every month. You may be doing that already, especially if you fly a lot. You may be producing 3 or 4 metric tons of CO2 per month. So Peter Kalmus, and if you haven't seen it already, he does come across pretty humbly, and I can tell you in person he is. He boldly suggests otherwise, that in fact we have it all completely wrong. Again, this is kind of what minimalists have been saying. This stuff, all the stuff of consumerist society and our preoccupation with it, is not going to make you happy. In fact, it has just the opposite effect. It makes us unhappier. And by the way, we know that. I mean, I don't know that anyone has completely linked the correlation, as a causal relationship, but there's a definite correlation that happened in the second half of the 20th century as we acquired more and more and more stuff. And this would be my generation and the one before it and the one after. Happiness went down. So when people have been tracking that, and if you look at other parts of the world, people who are consuming much less, they are actually statistically, by all these studies, they're happier. So people in Costa Rica is much less wealthy than the United States, and yet people there are actually happier. And we're going to have people comment on this in the comments too. Of course, this mindset, and this is what Peter Kalmus is encouraging us to believe, it runs counter completely to, what companies hourly are selling us online and, tell us each day that having stuff will make us happy. And the flip side is not having it will make us miserable. And of course, this is the message they want to sell us, because if it's, on the one hand, a carrot, having the stuff will make us happy. It'll make us buy their stuff. And if it's sort of a stick, you will be unhappy or be sort of socially outcast if you don't buy their stuff, then you buy their stuff. It's not about you. I mean, it's never about you. It's never about us consumers. It's always about people who are producing the stuff. And if you don't believe it, I mean, and it's actually becoming less of an issue now, and I mentioned it before, but it used to be influencers always had pictures themselves somewhere, like on their Instagram, in a private jet, and that was just part of it. Now, I think people know, first with the Kardashians, and now with Taylor Swift and all, that's come under fire, and it's a good thing, but it's only one tiny thing of that oversized consumptive lifestyle that they're selling. So not only does Peter Kalmus believe, and this is from personal experience, it's not some theory that he wrote his dissertation on. In fact, his dissertation was on gravitational waves at Columbia, even though he did his undergraduate at Harvard. Otherwise, a range of people are now coming to the same conclusion. So the minimalists, we tapped into this, but Peter Kalmus is going to introduce us to another range, another type of people who are basically, broadly minimalist, but they're not doing it just for like a self-care kind of thing. They're doing it for the planet as well. So the film, the alternate film, and if you've watched English 22, then you will or have already watched Tomorrow. It's called Demian. It's actually a French film, so you're aware it's dubbed in English, but I'm sorry, not dubbed, it has closed captioning in English. And it's not just following one individual or a small family like Peter Kalmus, but it goes across the world looking at a range of people that are in this project of trying to figure out what the future needs to hold, to figure out how we can live happily and sustainably on the planet, and how this can be shared by everyone on the planet. So I'll let the filmmakers use their words to describe it. Today, we sometimes feel powerless in front of various crises of our times. I think that's a great understatement. I think many of us are feeling that way daily, and something like climate anxiety comes out of it. Today, we know the answers lie in a wide mobilization of the human race. Over the course of a century, our dreams of progress, commonly called the American dream, and again, this is coming from a French production crew, commonly called the American dream, fundamentally changed the way we live and continues to inspire many developing countries. That's true. All over the planet, other countries, other people are aspiring to the model that we've set. We are now, however, aware of the setbacks and limits of such developmental policies. We urgently need to focus our efforts on changing our dreams before something irreversible happens to the planet. So again, the key issue here is not new technology. It's not teching our way out of this, but we need to focus on changing our dream, our aspiration. Today, we need a new direction, a new objective, a new dream. The documentary Tomorrow sets out to showcase alternative and creative ways of viewing agriculture, economics, energy, and education. It offers constructive solutions on a local level to make a difference on a global level. So basically, and you might want to watch this film just for your own edification, even if you don't have to, because instead of just giving you one example, one family, one place, Pasadena, California, this documentary takes you to places all over the world, and you see here and there little snapshots of what other people are doing. Tomorrow is not just a film, it's the beginning of a movement seeking to encourage local communities around the world to change the way that they live for the sake of the planet. So you watch minimalism, you might think, well, this is a movement. People are talking about being minimalist. You see things on tidying up on Netflix and all. Yeah, that's something of a movement. That movement, honestly, is sort of crested now, and it's sort of declining. But this movement, we all can hope, will continue on, and it's happening across the planet. I wanted you to take a sort of a closer look at here in California with Peter Kalmus, but this documentary looks at it across the planet. And I have to say, it's an encouraging, optimistic film because it's so, it lets you know that people all over the world are in this project together. So I'm curious, as usual, to hear your thoughts on Being the Change in Tomorrow. And if it is indeed the beginning of a movement, the beginning of profound change in the way that our species inhabits the planet, because that's really what's being said here. It's a different dream. It's not the old American dream of more, but it's a new dream. It's not an American dream in the sense that it's happening all over the planet now. People are globally connected, and they are doing that. So take the second eye clicker poll. Put it over here. So I'm not asking about you here, but do you know people that have made significant lifestyle changes to become more sustainable? And that could be anything from switching to a largely plant-based diet, switching away from doing a lot of travel, especially air travel. And yes, you definitely know people that have. You know of people, kind of a little bit acquaintances, not necessarily friends, or you sort of know about some people, a friend of a friend, or some level of disconnection, or no, you haven't, or you're just not quite sure. And yeah, so the first two or three, either you know, have acquaintances, or well, the first three collectively together, one way or another, you know closely, or at least of someone who has made these sort of changes, which kind of answers that question I just posed. Is this a movement? Is it happening? Well, the very fact that most people in the room either closely know or know of someone who is making these sort of changes, I think that is that's encouraging, suggesting it is something of a movement. It actually is a movement, but so my normal disclaimer about I haven't paraphrased or altered anything, and then we'll go right into the comments. First comment. This week's film truly made me rethink the way I live. Seeing such a happy, mentally healthy family living their lives in a very sustainable way was eye-opening for me. The most eye-opening part of the film for me was just the simple fact that Peter Kalmus went to Harvard, works for NASA, and has all the brains and probably money in the world to live in a mansion, a massive mansion with 10 cars, yet he lives in a quaint little home in Pasadena, and his vegetable mobile of a car and happy little family. So there are a number of comments like this, and I'll jump to the next one before kind of fleshing it out. But yeah, just to be clear about that vegetable mobile, Peter Kalmus has a car, you'll see in the documentary, that is running on waste vegetable oil. So he goes to places like McDonald's and gets that oil that, you know, your fries are fried in and all, and actually modified his car to run on that. He actually, I should tell you, this film was made a few years ago. He actually has an electric car now too, but he still gets to most places on his bike. But let me go to the next comment, which is similar to this. Peter Kalmus is the perfect example of living a happier life without fossil fuels. His life isn't a situation where he's simply making the best out of what he has. In fact, he has the brains and the resources to make a lot of money, especially with his Harvard degree. He had the opportunity to drive a nice car, live in a big house, and do all the things that we think will make us happy. Instead, he gave up a potentially lavish lifestyle to live one that involves less things, but more happiness, more relationships, mindfulness, peace, and joy. Both comments are really well said. So if you think about it, and if you watched it already, you know that in many ways Peter Kalmus is an inspiration in more than one way. First, sure, that he dramatically reduced his individual carbon footprint. I mean, if you read the opening, stuff about this documentary, that's the big thing. I mean, that's what the documentary is about. Can we actually reduce our carbon footprint and all? So totally inspirational, right? But second, as these comments note, and they really both focus in on it, and a number of comments had, given his obvious gifts and talents and education, if he had aspired to the American dream, and knowing him personally, I have absolutely no doubt that he could have gone to some place like the Silicon Valley and had it all. Although many people pine for that, to be this sort of, kind of like Elon Musk person that would go and find enormous success and have everything. Few people, including myself, actually have the ability to fully realize this current supersized American dream. But all indication are that Peter Kalmus could have been one of those lucky few. And actually, to underscore that, Peter Kalmus went to Harvard and then went and got his PhD at Columbia, But as I noted, he was focusing on gravitational waves, the detection of them. And if you know, in the last decade, gravitational waves were in fact detected. And after he got his PhD, Peter Kalmus was in that group that was working on it. That group, the people in it, received Nobel Prizes for it. But Peter Kalmus, in the middle of the project, decided that he didn't want to devote his life to that anymore. And he decided to shift, which is tough to do after you've already gotten your PhD and you already have, you're in a research field, shift to working on the climate crisis. So he went from being this very theoretical guy working on gravitational wave detection to a very practical guy working on the climate crisis. And that's why I made that statement that the one I just said, in that, I think he could have switched to a lot of things. I think he could have shifted gravitational waves to working on, transformative AI if he had wanted to. In fact, he's pretty good at programming. But as a climate scientist, Kalmus knew full well that, the American dream is, as we've suggested, environmentally and in terms of happiness, an American nightmare, a climate nightmare, a spiritual nightmare. Consequently, acting on this knowledge, he turned his back on everything that he could have had. He turned his back on the American dream. And again, I think he's someone who really could have had the American dream supersized. And then in that sense, I think he becomes this sort of shining model for people like us in wealthy countries. Sure, we in a wealthy country like the United States are in a position to pursue this dream of, having it all, having all these things. But could we actually, seeing all that in our grasp, believing full well we could do it, and probably being quite right that we could do it, could we turn around and turn it down and say no, that you could have it all, but instead reject it all? So to many people, I think voluntarily walking away from the dream in the hope of having it all may seem ridiculous. Peter Kalmus may seem ridiculous, absurd, because here's a person who could have had everything and he walked away from it all. As he explains, though, he wasn't walking away from anything good or meaningful. He was walking not away, but toward a more meaningful, better, happier, and in the bargain, more sustainable life. And finally, and I think perhaps most intriguingly here, is the fact that Kalmus does not focus on technological solutions. I said that before, but I'll say it again. We fully might expect him as a scientist to do that instead of focusing on what he does, simple changes to our daily lives. And in that sense, he becomes a great model because you don't have to have a PhD to be able to make these little lifestyle changes that he makes. He's modeling something that anyone can do. There's nothing high tech about anything in the documentary or anything that he does. Starting a garden in your backyard is not super high tech. It does require knowledge. He underscores that he has to learn and is still learning how to farm his backyard successfully, but it's not super high tech. And so even though he is a climate scientist, and even though he is a successful person that probably could have been, financially far more successful, really he's modeling in the film how pretty much anyone could live a sustainable life. There's no high-tech, magic there. And I think that's a really profound message coming from him. And it also means, just to be clear, and this is coming from a scientist, that we don't need to hand over the future to scientists and technological solutions. Rather, anybody can be an architect of the future here. Kalmus is showing that, not because there's anything special about him, but because he's such an ordinary person in the kind of ordinary life changes he makes. And in fact, for this to work, everyone needs to take up this challenge. So it wouldn't make sense for it to be this really esoteric thing. If this was all about how you really need a PhD to solve the climate crisis, this wouldn't be a very useful film for anyone, for everyone. It would be useful for a very small percentage of the population. But the lifestyle that he's talking about is something that anyone, and certainly anyone in this room, can live. So next comment. After watching the documentary, I was fascinated on how Peter Kalmus reduced his emissions by more than a factor of 10, yet still kept an average lifestyle. So I drew attention to this at the introduction, but it's worth focusing on this achievement. And again, not just that he reduced his emissions by a factor of 10, and became happier, but it's an ordinary life. It's nothing. If you met him and you went into his house and all, there wouldn't be big signals that something is really different there. To quote this person's comment again, Peter Kalmus reduced his emissions by more than a factor of 10, yet kept an average lifestyle. As this person notes, it's not just that Kalmus was able to reduce his emissions. What is in some ways more amazing, it's just this very ordinary life. And in some sense, that's the real story here. And as I noted in the beginning, I suspect that most people in the US believe that it's possible to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions by a factor of 10. But what's that life going to be like? I think one of the reasons that few people attempt, to go all in and do something like that is because they imagine that it's going to be a pretty horrible life, that you're going to be giving up everything and living this really drab existence. But Peter Kalmus subtly, but I think really powerfully, makes a counter argument that the things that we've been told make us happy just don't make us happy. And the little things that we take for granted, and we do. And what do I mean by that? Time with friends, time with family, they're a far more reliable source of happiness. And as a terrific intersectional bonus, they generally don't require significant greenhouse gas emissions. So all the things you've been told that are going to make you happy, things that people are selling you, and the consequence, things that need, enormous amount of greenhouse gases to be emitted to make, they don't compare to the things that instead make us really happy. Just time with friends, time with family, time with yourself, time being more aware of your life. And we'll talk about mindfulness because meditation practices are important to Peter Kalmus's approach. Next comment. So I'm going to talk alternately back and forth about both films. And I know most people didn't watch Tomorrow, but I kind of want to do this to underscore this is a really great film too. So the comment is, when watching the film Tomorrow, I was reminded that there are many good people in this world who want to make a difference. Sometimes I get discouraged. Yeah, don't we all? Not only by the damage that we are inflicting on our planet, but also by the number of people who are willing to do nothing and watch the world fall apart, or worse yet, continue to actively support the systems that are causing all this harm. Yeah, it's a great comment. And it's a great way the person has phrased it, because many of us in wealthy countries are, as this person notes here, actively supporting the systems that are causing harm. And a lot of us are just sitting and not doing anything about it, not trying to bring about it. It's not that we're just engaged in this, but we're not trying to actively jump in and stop it from happening. And in a sense, I would argue that the documentary on Peter Kalmus is in some sense bittersweet. So it's terrific to see what Peter and his family have done, but it's after all just one family. Yes, we do meet a few of Peter Kalmus's friends, which is great during the documentary and interesting, but it hardly seems like a social movement. So I think that's the sad thing if you just watched it, which is why I coupled it with Tomorrow, because sure, it can be done. People are doing it, but who's doing it? Not many people. Although, as our iClicker poll suggested, all of you know someone in some way that's trying to do something. So that's why I paired it with Tomorrow. So, because across the planet, it's not just Peter Kalmus and here and other people in California, and there are lots of other people in California doing it. All sorts of people across the planet are doing what they can, making changes to mitigate the climate crisis. They are, generally speaking, and this is a problem, they're not high-profile influencers, which of course is deeply unfortunate. You can find them online, but you have to look for them. They're not the things that the algorithm is going to put in front of you all the time when you're on YouTube or wherever, TikTok, wherever you are. And it would be provocative to think what would happen if one really A-lister, really major A-lister were to make the lifestyle changes that Peter Kalmus did. So I forget how many people subscribe to Kim Kardashian. It's like 300 plus million people. Wouldn't it be astonishing if she just did this lifestyle change? It's not going to happen, I guess. Maybe she would lose, 299 million of her subscribers. I don't know. But the optimistic thing is, because that's kind of a sad thought that's not happening. The optimistic thing is across the planet, there are people doing it. You may not be aware of them. Again, they're not popping up for you unless you go looking, and I would encourage you to do that. And these are, as this comment notes, they're small projects like public space garden. So, there's an empty lot on your block, somewhere. People are converting that to be a public garden where people can all garden there. And, it's not, but as this person notes here, they're opening up the conversation to talk about this. In essence, it's a form of communication, right? Because when you do these actions, people see your actions and they ask about your actions and trying to understand your actions. And that kind of curiosity, as I suggested during our last class on communication, is ideal because it gets the project going. Yeah, so let me go to the next comment, which it continues this one, but I'll read it because it's great. It was refreshing to hear people discuss their solutions. I love how the film took us to different places around the world and showed us how people are making real changes in various locations. One of my favorite little change was public space garden they introduced in England. Not only do these gardens provide sustainable foods, but the fact that they're out in public on busy roads allows people to open up a conversation about them. The public appearance spreads awareness. I like the change because it doesn't seem too difficult to do. People in the US seem to be resistant to major changes, but I feel like many would support small changes like the garden. And I think that is really a terrific message coming out of this apt reading of the film Tomorrow. Yeah, major issues are great. That's why we did the Green New Deal. It's huge. We need that. We need to, to get the right politicians to do that. But what else can you do? Little things, vacant lot, converting it to a garden. It's like not a big deal, but it gets people, it's visible, people see it, it gets community forming. In other words, people are out there doing what they're doing, sharing their knowledge. And if you've ever been to something like a community garden, we have them all over the place, including at UCSB, we have a farm if you want to actually go ahead. It's not a big farm, they call it a farm. It's a nice sized garden. But if you actually want to get involved in doing that, it's great. You'll see there's a community of people. People will share their knowledge, what they're doing. You can transplant it, no pun intended, to something like Ivy, where people are also doing the same sort of thing. So, there's a quote by Martin Heidegger, who's a German philosopher from the 20th century, who's really a pretty despicable person, but he was an important person. He has a great quote now, which is, "Here now in small things, let the saving power begin." It's not going to, big things are great, but little things can begin the process. So next comment. Watching Peter Kalmus's day-to-day routine was really interesting for me to see. Where he lives in Pasadena is about 20 minutes from my hometown. Seeing him in Pasadena really opened my eyes to how it is possible to live an incredibly climate-conscious lifestyle while still living in a desirable place and having a different aspect of the so-called American dream. While it was inspiring to see Kalmus close to my hometown, it was also a bit disheartening because I realized how little I know about the efforts toward mitigating the climate crisis in my community. Peter spoke about collecting veggie oil, free fruit stands, going to community meetings, none of which I even knew about, and they're right in my backyard. Yeah, great comment. And it touches on a number of really important points. First off, this can be made anywhere, right? Pasadena or a town 20 minutes away, it doesn't matter. But Pasadena is an interesting example to think about, which is one of the reasons I assigned this particular documentary, because it's generally speaking a pretty wealthy community. Right? It is wealthier than most communities in the United States, and certainly wealthier than most communities across the globe. It is a very privileged place. It's very similar in many regards to Santa Barbara in that sense, and it's also composed of smaller, older houses and all. And the reason I think this is important, not that Pasadena can become, an international global model of what we need to do, but it sometimes may seem that aspirations that you may have for wealth and the American dream are incompatible with sustainability, right? That, in other words, you might imagine that wealthy communities, what do you think of when you think of a wealthy community? Big houses, McMansions, cars, maybe lots of them, tons of consumer products and all. That's might be it. And, some wealthy communities no doubt are, but Peter Kalmus provides something of a blueprint for how even wealthy communities become sustainable. And I think it's especially inspiring because it makes clear, as this person aptly notes, it's possible to, I'm quoting this person, to live an incredibly climate conscious lifestyle while still living it in a desirable place and having different aspects of the so-called American dream. As such, in his modest, and again, in his modest way, Peter Kalmus is offering a new version of the American dream, one that is indeed desirable but sustainable. So I think it would be great, and you'll see tomorrow, you'll see different communities that aren't nearly as wealthy across the planet, and they're doing something that is, much more sustainable. And that's absolutely necessary, absolutely terrific. But I'm pitching this, and I think Peter Kalmus has pitched this at you. So in other words, you want to go out and have a nice life. You want to be successful. You want to be wealthy. Okay, that's fine. But if you do, then what will you do with that? How will you convert that into a happy, rewarding, fulfilling life that's great for you, every other being on the planet, human and otherwise, and the planet? Peter Kalmus is offering you a solution to that, a new flavor of the American dream. And again, not filled with big houses and tons of stuff, but filled with greater happiness. So let me jump to the next one. Yeah, the American education system needs to do a better job at teaching people life skills so they can have confidence to try acquiring other skills. I used to live in Mexico, and over there they start teaching kids in middle school about mechanics and electricity, among other useful life skills, which I have noticed mostly no one here has, and it's no surprise that most people here just wait for someone else to fix the problem rather than attempting to contribute to the solution, and that's a big problem. So if you have already watched Being the Change, you'll know that they talk about repair culture there and all, the right to repair. And as this person rightly notes, that's great, but we don't even have those skills, right? We're disconnected from those skills. And it's not just to repair things, but the example I just gave a minute or two ago, how to actually grow your own food. You may have a yard and all, but do you know how to actually use that to grow food? Most people have like a big idea, but as an actual roll up your sleeve, get the experience out there, we don't have it. And it points to a subtle message, I think, from Being Change. And that is, in a consumer society like ours, we often rely more on our ability to purchase solutions than to have the skills to actually resolve them ourselves. And again, that's then the message, right? All you have to do is make money. Make as much money as you can, and that will solve all your problems. You can, buy anything you want. If it breaks, you can pay to have someone else fix it, or just buy a new thing and all. That's the message. You only need one skill, and one skill alone. Be hyper specialized. Figure out how to make money, as much of it as you can. But that can have profound environmental implications, right? Because we throw things out, unaware that the fact that we could just fix something. And there are lots of things like that. We don't even know how to go about it. And the problem is twofold. And that is, as we saw from Vance Packard, objects aren't designed to be repaired anymore. And most of us don't have the skills to repair them. So throughout Being the Change, Peter Kalmus and many of the people, by the way, he introduces us to display a real kind of roll up your sleeves approach to the problem. Instead of trying to purchase some new sort of high-tech solution, Kalmus jumps right in and works through the problem. However, to be able to do this, he needs to acquire those skills, which he does. As this person aptly notes, the contemporary K through 12 educational system in the US doesn't teach those skills. If it did, perhaps there'd be more people like Peter Kalmus jumping right in. And by the way, these can be any kind of skills. It's not just that you could fix your toaster if it goes wrong. It's not just that you learn how to grow food, but it could be something like repairing your own clothing. It could be like upcycling your own clothing, knowing how, for example, to dye your clothes if they start getting a little, not looking so good, how to repair them, how to do patch repairs like Boro, how to make them your own through things like embroidery. The whole new way of approaching something like fashion. It's the opposite of fast fashion. It is an upcycled, very, very slow fashion. But to do that, you need to acquire those skills. So let me check to see if people have been making comments in the Q&A. Let's see. So a few comments that are sort of disconnected, but I'll just address them. People want to know. We know that eating turkey and chicken are better than beef, but is eating pork also better than eating beef? Yes, pork is better than eating beef. Lamb is not better than eating beef generally. And the reason for that is, as you may know, cows and sheep are grazing animals, and to be able to eat grass, something that you and I and our dogs and cats can't do, they have to have that stomach, that's sort of a chemical factory that breaks down the fiber of the grass, but in the process, they burp out a ton of methane. Pigs don't work that way. Pigs are better. So if you have to choose, if you're eating meat from a large mammal, go for pork. Yeah. Comment, is there not the irony that Peter Kalmus works in a jet propulsion laboratory? What are your overall thoughts on the use of taxpayer dollars to fund space exploration given its climate footprint? I know that currently only a very small amount of people have ever gotten in a rocket, yet this may change in the future with the privatization of space travel. Well, yeah, the privatization of space travel is also the monetization of space travel. You may know that there are these billionaires who want to fly other billionaires into space, and are in the process of doing it right now. If you want to see a great send-up of that from our friend Leonardo DiCaprio, you can see Don't Look Up, which is the film. I think it's still on Netflix. But yeah, I think space exploration is good. I think things like the Webb telescope is phenomenal. I think the idea of sending tourists into space doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I think the idea of Elon Musk's idea of trying to get a colony of 1 million human beings on Mars by 2050 is just ridiculous, really. I think we have, a planet here we have to pay more attention to. It's not that space exploration is not bad. Space tourism is doubtful, and colonization of other planets at this point doesn't make much sense to me. You asked, I answered. Okay, next comment. As I scrolled through these comments, I noticed that many people said the most interesting part of the film, Being the Change, was the connection between meditation and the climate crisis. I can't help but agree. I first thought, why is this part of the documentary so long? What does it have to do with global warming, and why am I watching it? But now that I think about it, the connection is rather obvious. We have learned in this class about how the U.S. how in the U.S. often the idea of happiness is linked to the American dream and consumerism. That's how you achieve happiness in the U.S., by consuming, which drives our carbon footprints through the roof, which it does. Meditation, on the other hand, as well as other practices such as religion, lifestyle changes, minimalism, I'd add yoga, and a whole range of other things, help us detach from the idea that happiness must come from owning more stuff, having a bigger house, driving a nicer car, and flying to extravagant places. So it's interesting, when Peter Kalmus zoomed in to one of my classes, not the one last year, but it was before that, he noted that the section of Being the Change that raised the most eyebrows was on meditation. And he was in fact surprised by that, because he knew that it might be controversial when he wrote the book and the film was made. But he thought that the main thing that people were going to freak out over, I think was really odd, was humanure. And that's the idea of, taking your own stool and composting it, which if you haven't seen the documentary, he does. And he thought everybody's going to be skeeved by that and talk about that. But in fact, the comments in that class and a number of comments that people made in our class were about meditation. And I'm going to quote from the section that he has in the book on meditation, because I thought it was good. This is how he opens it. Peter Kalmus. Whereas the immediate physical cause of global warming is our greenhouse gas emissions. As a scientist, he would say that. That's true. However, the deepest underlying cause of the broader predicament is our wanting. So wanting, W-A-N-T-I-N-G, desiring. Wanting drives both consumerism and overpopulation. We endlessly want more money, more sex, more prestige, a faster car, a bigger house, fancier furniture. And when we get something we want, the relief from our desire is fleeting. In a short time, we again want more. Wanting is a bottomless pit. He continues. Not only is wanting straining the biosphere to its breaking point, it's causing us to suffer. When we want something, it's because we're not satisfied in the present moment. Indeed, the entire purpose of the advertising industry is to cause us to feel unsatisfied with what we have. When we want, we feel agitated, unable to appreciate the miracles right in front of us. So, if Peter Kalmus is right, sure makes a compelling argument there for it. If wanting and dissatisfaction is the problem, then what's the solution to ease that suffering? To Kalmus, meditation is part of the answer as it focuses us on the present moment, which is where true happiness can be found. By the way, this dynamic was not, figured out by Peter Kalmus, or even recently. The central teachings of Buddhism, of the Buddha, was that. If you've ever heard what's Buddhism about, is to relieve suffering in the world. Suffering is kind of a bad word for that translation, because Buddha was probably writing in a language called Pali. Well, he doesn't write anything. It's only a couple centuries after him it's written down. But suffering is not the problem. A better word is like desiring, or to use Peter Kalmus's word, is wanting. That's the problem with the human condition. Why are we unhappy? Because we want. We want more. So I'll quote the Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh, who just passed away a couple of years ago. And one of the students who co-wrote Zen and the Art of Saving the Planet came to English 24 last year, will probably come this year. Thich Nhat Hanh says, meditation is an opportunity to take time, sit down, and figure out what true happiness really is. We discover that we already have more than enough conditions to be happy right now, right here in the present moment. So simply put, Thich Nhat Hanh, Peter Kalmus, the Buddha, they're saying, once we realize true happiness can be found right here in the present moment with what we have, there's no need to pursue it through an endless array of consumer goods. And I would extend that to be, not only could you find it in meditation, but you can find it with what you have, with your friends, your family, your pet, walking outside, enjoying the food that you're eating more thoroughly. To someone who does not have a meditation practice, I know that's going to sound paradoxical, even ridiculous, because how can not having anything give us happiness? Don't we need things to make us happy? But the answer here, Peter Kalmus's answer, and again, following on 2,600 years of thinking, is that, no, things only add to our suffering. Wanting, desiring only adds to our suffering. If you stop and reflect on this insight for a moment, you realize that what a profound implication this has for the climate crisis. And that's what Peter Kalmus is trying to get at. A lavish lifestyle filled with things both exacerbates our suffering. It just creates more suffering in the sense of desiring and wanting, and which doesn't work. And it's bringing about the climate crisis itself. So why does Peter Kalmus push for meditation? Because meditation promises to both ease that suffering, the way the Buddhists usually translate it, that wanting. So if you can reduce that wanting, if you can just stop a minute and think about what really matters in life. And again, you don't have to go all the way back to the Buddha. We can go back 170 years to Henry David Thoreau. That was his same project. It came in part because he read the Buddha. He does rip it off, but it is the same message. They're all saying the same message, that, if you just stop and reflect and maybe literally do that and spend 5 minutes, 25 minutes, or in Peter Kalmus's case, he spends an hour meditating in the morning and an hour meditating at night, you can get a better sense of what really matters in the world and to you. Um, yeah, long comment here, but I'll read it. In fact, there are many comments like that, like this. You can read it? Kind of small, sorry. The film Tomorrow reminded us a lot of my childhood. I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky, which is the 15th largest city in the United States, despite people assuming that there's nothing in Kentucky. Part of my summers in elementary school was garden camp, which were hosted by a church run by some of the parents' friends. The entire day is spent learning how to grow food, how to harvest it, how to turn it into yummy meals. We picked tomatoes. We picked tomatoes, made them in tomato sauce. We grew corn to make in fun dishes. We learned about edible flowers to make pretty cakes. This was such an experience for me because I was so young. I didn't see the value in these skills and just saw it as a way to get dirty. I really appreciate this film because it did more than just show us everything we're doing wrong. It showed us more than to just be vegan. I think it's extremely important to see how interconnected our society and culture is with environmentalism. Being able to see these examples of communities doing things brings me a lot of hope that we can hopefully implement this in the United States more. Yes, it feels small, but it's more and more small towns, and with more and more small towns and cities were able to implement this, it feels like our larger government might start listening. There were many, many comments like this, people bringing in their own experiences. I quoted this one, it's long, but this person cohesively talks about how there was an effort, even in Louisville, Kentucky, to do this, to get people more connected with their lives, to learn how to do things like raising food. So this comment similar to it. This week I watched Tomorrow since I already saw Being the Change last quarter in English 22. After watching it, I'm honestly inspired. I feel like I want to go down to my local garden supply shop, go in my backyard and really get my hands dirty. Having grown up in a more rural place before moving into the suburbs at a young age, my family farmed and grew crops to the side on the side while working their other jobs as a hobby, and I took it as a supplementary income after retirement. I have fond memories from being a kid and going to the farmer's market and selling our crops. I still love going to markets and picking up whatever fresh produce looks good, whatever artisans grow that looks good. This person continues. To be fair, the way that the whole urban farming movement has been brought to the public sphere has been pretty pastoral. In other words, pretty idealistic. Imagine a simple country life. It's being made to seem super simple. And to be fair, it's inherently simple as a facet of nature. But the interactions that happen between the crops, trade secrets, and the general finesse that goes into producing crops is a serious skill, like the farm in France that was working on their biodiversity. And again, that's in the film Tomorrow. I'd be lying if I said that I hadn't killed my share of crops, since my thumb isn't very green. But farming is just like any other skill. Understanding what goes into it, what works and what doesn't work, are the really important facets to success. As time goes on and you work to improve the skills, you can really hone your craft and turn it into something special and successful. Yeah, and by the way, Peter Kalmus has that same message in Being the Change, that he's learning how to do it. And by the way, just my own personal anecdote to underscore this: I grew up on a farm, and I can tell you it is a lot about not something you can distill and learn in a manual, although that's clearly part of it, but just a way of being, of knowing how to do things, of being able to look at crops to see what the problem is, if there's a drought, if there's too much water, or whatever. And the problem is, I would argue, that most people, and many people made this comment. So remember the comment we had about someone saying in Mexico you learn mechanical skills and all, you don't here in the US, which is true. But these comments are focusing in on something particular, and it's a theme we've been dealing with throughout ever since, even before we looked at Cowspiracy. And that is, most people in the US have a disconnected relationship with our food. For the most part, there are quite a few intermediaries between us and the food we eat. We don't generally, grow our own food. We don't generally even buy our food from the people that grow it, right? So you can do that if you go to a farmer's market here in Goleta on Sundays. Sometimes the people who grow it, there are sometimes people who work with them or for them, or they're selling it. but we buy it from stores that have little connection to the actual production. So that can be a big store like Costco or a supermarket, but even something like the Co-op and IB. But there you're getting more of a connection to it. And the idea would be to try to reduce the intermediaries between you and the food, and you can do that directly if you have a little piece of yard, or if you can do, as the person noted regarding the film Damien, Tomorrow, if you use a community garden. And the thing that's surprising about this globally, that's really not the case. And again, that underscores privilege. You might not think going into, Albertsons is a privilege, but 3 out of 4 farms on the planet are small farms, not agribusiness, small subsistence farms. They're about 2.5 acres in size, so relatively small. Nearly 2 billion people, which is like a quarter of the planet's population, are subsistence farmers who grow their own food. We are an exception here globally. Across the planet, people are connected with their food in a way that we can only imagine, unless you take the plunge, like Peter Kalmus or some of the folks you met in Tomorrow. And those, it's throughout sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, parts of South, Central America, all over the planet where people are connected with the land. But Tomorrow, the film reveals that there's this growing movement, to reconnect people in wealthy countries like the US to the food that we eat. Peter Kalmus is trying to do that. And this is, again, a sort of a mindfulness thing. It's an awareness thing. And as both of the 2 comments we just had, that long comment and then this 2-part one, both of these people think of it as a fun experience and fond memories. And the irony in the United States is we do grow a lot, but kind of the wrong things. So if you ask people in the US, what do you think the largest crop is in the United States? You're probably going to say like corn or soybeans, and they're both huge. But it's not. It's turf grass. It's our lawns. Our lawns are, 3 times more. It takes 3 times more land, 3 times more water, more pesticides, more herbicides, more fossil fuel fertilizers go on lawns than corn, wheat, soybeans, or anything else in the United States. And the average lot in the United States is like 1/5 of an acre. And, you can grow an enormous amount of food in an urban farm on 1/5 of an acre. And people are already putting all this effort in, taking care of their lawns, going out every, weekend and mowing them and dosing them with herbicides so daisies don't pop up and all. But that's just a cultural practice. And honestly, in English 22, we talked about that. That's really coming out of 400 years ago in Europe, where people had these large country estates, and to prove that you were wealthy and that you didn't need to grow food, people had these large palatial lawns out front, framing the property. And that was associated with wealth, with the landed gentry, with the people that aggregated the most wealth over generations in Europe. And we still hold on to that in the United States. Somewhere in our memory is the fact that having a suburban home with a beautiful lawn makes you seem wealthy and powerful. And yet the irony is, here we have more than enough, property all across the United States to grow things, and yet we've, sort of shifted everything over to have people grow things for us. And industrial agriculture is a huge problem when we could be growing a good bit of our own food if we just wanted to. Ken asked, I asked before if this is the beginning of a movement. I personally feel it is. Next comment. I think that there are more people than before that care about our planet and are finding simple and even creative ways to reduce their carbon footprint. It really doesn't seem that hard to do, but we have to remember it's not about owning more, but about owning less and just living a simpler life. Walking or riding a bike to places instead of driving there, growing some of our own food, using less electricity, buying less stuff, wasting less food, and switching to a plant-based diet are not impossible things to do, like older generations make it out to be. Yeah, this is a great comment, and it really applies to both documentaries that we saw for this week. Peter Kalmus and the various people in Tomorrow found, as this person notes, simpler and even more creative ways to reduce their carbon footprint. The person also aptly notes, doesn't really seem that hard to do. We just have to remember it's not about owning more, but about owning less, and all the things that that person says. And the fact is, I think that's the real message that these documentaries are trying to get out, that it's not only going to make you happier, and look at every one of the examples, not just Peter Kalmus, but the examples from tomorrow, but it's going to be better for the planet. But the other thing, what's encouraging about these, and so many people commented on, it's not impossible. I mean, this person notes that older generations who are set in their ways of the cultural practices they have might say, well, we'll never change and all. But here, example after example after example of people changing in all sorts of ways, all sorts of practices, but the same two, results. The planet is better off, and they're better off individually. And to note that person before, you can create fond memories and fun experiences. Okay, let me run this to the end so I can take my daughter to the doctor and you all can go home. Yeah, so I asked you before, have you been contemplating making changes? Do you know someone making changes? Third eye clicker poll, have you made changes, significant, some changes, sort of changes, whatever. Okay. And the top 3. So that's good. Okay, see you next week. Have a great weekend.